All right, what's going on, guys? In today's video, we're going to be going over what stats tools to use and why those stats tools should be kind of prioritized, or what to really look for in a stat tracking app. This is one of the most common questions that I get when I'm talking to families. Either they're interested in potentially getting into tracking their stats for their junior golfer, or they're in a position where they're already using a particular app and they would like to either continue to use that app, or they're wondering if that's the best decision for them. If you're new to the channel, we cover junior golf and how to develop to play Division I golf specifically. So if that's the type of thing you're interested in, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. But let's go ahead and dive right into that. So first things first, we got to think about like why use stats at all. I would say the majority of junior golfers don't use stats at the moment. Or if they do, it might be fairly, let's say, rudimentary. You've got your fairways hit, greens hit. Maybe you track the number of putts that you have per round. And maybe you do that in something like a GHIN app or something like that. But there's also plenty of junior golfers who don't even track their handicap in the GHIN app. But why do this at all? I think is a really good question to be asking. The first thing is objective measurement. So we want to have some way that we're able to look at your game and be able to understand what's going on without any emotions. Because if we just go based on our emotions, we're not going to be very successful. It's going to be very hard to have accurate information. And so, those of you, parents who are watching this, especially if you're in a situation where maybe you own a business or you're in a position of authority, you understand the importance of being able to look at data and numbers in order to make decisions rather than going based off your emotions, because you might feel like something's the case, but then you might look at the numbers and it might tell a completely different story. And that in order to be successful, you need to go based on what those numbers are telling you and optimize around that rather than just whatever you felt like at the time. You can obviously imagine how much more important that is for, let's say, a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, a 14-year-old. If they want to play golf at a high level, they need to have a clear idea of like what the heck's even going on with their game. And they're not going to understand that by just going out there and hitting balls. So hopefully that makes sense. The next one is you want to use it to actually inform practice sessions. It's not just enough to say, hey, I track my stats, I know what my strokes gained is. You want to actually be able to take that information and say, okay, because my numbers are this, then I need to do this in my practice. It's not very helpful to just go out there and just have a bunch of numbers. You have to actually know what that means for you and what you're going to do with that in practice specifically. It's also going to inform your on-course decision-making. Just kind of like throw out one example that I see all the time. And this will kind of get into one of the statistics that every stats tool needs to be able to track. And that is your greens and regulation on par threes, par fours, and par fives. One of the most common things that I see amongst junior golfers is in their minds, and in most people's minds, they see par fives as an opportunity to make birdies. They think, hey, the guys on the PGA Tour, they play these holes under par. Therefore, I should play these holes under par. And the way that I'm going to do that is being very aggressive on my second shot. Or they're somewhat careless on their second shot. And what ends up happening is their greens regulation on par fives is actually quite low relative to where it ought to be. And so being able to look at the data specifically, we're able to make intelligent decisions about, hey, I understand that the conventional wisdom, or maybe the more popular wisdom now, is you need to go for it every single time on par fives. But based on your numbers, for example, you're hitting the green 50% of the time on par fives, and you hit the ball on the green, let's say 80% of the time from 75 to 100 yards. If you made the simple decision to say, instead of trying to push for the green and leave yourself in a 30-yard bunker shot, you just strategically laid up to somewhere between 75 and 100 yards. Well, you've just taken your greens and regulation on par fives from 50% to 80%, and you didn't really have to do anything, different. You didn't have to improve literally at anything, but now you're hitting one more green, a little bit more than one more green per round. And that's worth essentially a shot per round. And so this is one of the ways for me, it's very easy to, improve players' scores if I have all of the data, because I can actually just say like, hey, here's just an obvious gap on just the decisions you're making on the golf course. Look, I just found you a shot, or I found you two shots. So very impactful in that way. The last one here is it's going to inform your on-course mindset. So this is one of the things that I see all the time is, a lot of the time, parents, junior golfers, they have issues with, maybe their child has blow up holes. They have a good round going on, and then they have a bad hole, and then they get kind of like carried away with that. They have another bad hole, and they just kind of like spiral. And then the reaction to that is, okay, let's go see a sports psychologist, or let's go and see somebody who can work on our mindset, teach us how to breathe, stuff like that. And it kind of accomplishes two things. Number one, it makes the kid feel like they're doing something wrong, or there's something wrong with them. And number two, it doesn't really address the root issue. A lot of the time, what is happening there is that the player does not understand what their actual scores should be based on their statistics, and they don't understand what to expect of themselves. So they get into this cycle, and you guys might have experienced this, where they shoot one of their best rounds ever, or their best round ever, or very good rounds, and then they think that that's who they are as a player now. And they go into their next round and they don't play as well. And then they're like, oh, well, it was because my mindset was bad. And it becomes this like thing of like, well, the swing coach, we feel good about the swing. Our only problem is our mindset. And, that they end up going to these tournaments where they, maybe they play well the first day, and it's like, oh, they got nervous and they don't play as well the second day. And it's like, yeah, they might've gotten nervous. That could be true. But the other side of this coin is you might have a situation where they just overperformed one day, and that should actually be seen as a good thing. And then the second day, they just reverted back to the average. And so there's nothing really to read into that. But if you go at that and say, oh, we got a mindset problem, now we just created this boogeyman. And so this is one of those things that data can really help you avoid making that mistake, because the analogy I always give is, imagine if you were a PGA Tour player. You go to a PGA Tour event, you shoot 62 the first day, and then you think to yourself, well, that's the type of player I am. I just go out there and shoot 62. So if I can just shoot 62 the next 3 days, well, then I'm going to be very successful in this tournament. It's like, yeah, obviously, but we also all know that would be completely absurd. If that player went and shot 69 or 71 the next day, that's not a failure. That just means that they just weren't quite as fortunate. They didn't have quite as many putts to drop. It's not the end of the world. And so in the same sense for your junior golfer, they could have a scenario where they shoot 9 shots worse the next day. And it's not necessarily because they had a bad mindset or something was wrong with them. It could actually just be because numbers work like that. And if you do something that's well outside of your average, odds are you're going to revert to the average. And so having the right statistics is actually going to help us look at the things that contribute to causing good scores and allow us to focus on those overall trends moving in a positive direction, rather than just momentary, like, hey, I did well in that tournament. So criteria. When we're looking at stats tools, I'm not dogmatic. I don't say, hey, there's one stats tool that everyone has to use. But I do have criteria for what I want to look for in a stats tool. And if a stats tool can't do these things, it really is going to limit your ability to get value out of that tool. So this is just super important here. I get asked about this all the time. So here's actually what you want to evaluate. If it has these things, it's great. It'll work. If it doesn't have these things, then you need to seriously consider the fact that you could have something that's better. So first thing is practice versus tournaments. You need to be able to differentiate how you perform in practice versus in tournaments. If you don't know this, then it's going to be really difficult to improve in tournaments. The whole reason that we're tracking stats, especially if you want to go on to play Division I golf, is we're going to be looking at something like Junior Golf Scoreboard, right? We're going to have an idea of what our scoring average is, and we're going to be wanting to bring that down over time. And then we're going to want to bring our scoring differential down over time, which is going to happen by playing in harder tournaments and lowering that scoring average. And so if I shoot 72 in practice, but I shoot 80 in tournaments, number one, I want to know that. And number two, I want to know why, because there's a disconnect happening there. Is it because I don't hit as many greens? Is it because I 3-putt too much? Is it because I start missing 3-footers? Like, we need to know that so that we can plan accordingly. It doesn't make a ton of sense to say, hey, you really struggle with this particular area of your game in tournaments, but you crush it in practice. So what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you practice just a ton. And it's like, you're already doing well. So that's not the right, move for that. Versus, let's say you're bad at something and you're bad at it in practice and you're bad at it in tournaments. Well, then we know strategically that if I improve in my practice, I'm I'm probably going to improve my tournaments. And that's really valuable to know. Versus another player, we know that there's a big gap. We don't want to load them up with tons and tons of practice and give them this idea that it's like, oh, hey, I'm playing really, really well. We know that already. What we want to do is figure out how do we get them in more tournament scenarios so that they can experience the problems that they're having in tournaments and that we can fix those where they're actually happening. So hopefully that makes sense. Next one is custom date ranges. This disqualifies a lot of stats tools out there. And the reason for that is you want to be able to look at your numbers and say, I made a change here. How has that impacted my statistics? If you don't have this, it's like, well, hey, the last 10 or the last 20 rounds or this strokes gained or whatever. It's like, who cares? It's not useful information. At the end of the day, the point of using stats is so that we have something that's useful. So we want to be able to say, hey, we made this adjustment on this particular date. How has that impacted our greens and regulation? How has that impacted our three putting? How has that impacted our make rate from this particular distance? We need to know that stuff so that we can look back and say, hey, the thing that we're doing is working or the thing that we're doing is not working. And we can use those things to kind of project out like, okay, how much do we have to improve over a particular period of time in order to accomplish our goals? So again, going back to Junior Golf Scoreboard, again, I don't use this as like, oh, hey, you're 11, you're 12, you're 13 years old. You need to use Junior Golf Scoreboard as like a way to get in front of college coaches. It becomes that in the future. But really what it does for you is it tells you, hey, we got a scoring differential of, I don't know, 6. And so we can say, all right, well, how much do we need to improve per year in order to reach our goals? Let's say we want to get to a scoring differential of -3. So we need to improve by 9 shots. Let's say we're a freshman right now. So we've got essentially 3 years ahead of us. We've got freshman, sophomore, and junior year in order to improve to that -3. Okay, well, we need to improve by 3 shots per year. Okay, is that probable for us to do? Well, you need to be able to measure. Be like, are you doing that? For me, when I'm working with my students, that's something that I measure meticulously. It's about 3.15 shots per year on average. So when I start working with a student, I know that on average, they're going to be able to accomplish that goal. And so again, you want to be able to do the same thing for your specific situation. The way that you can do that is looking at custom date ranges. Coach's access. This one should be fairly obvious, but if you're working with a coach, they should be referencing your statistics like all the time. Because if, like, let's say I was a swing coach, it would be malpractice for me, in my opinion. It would be malpractice for me to say, hey, we're going to change your golf swing or tweak your golf swing, whatever. And I don't have any pulse on, is the golf swing actually producing better results? Not just looking better on the camera, not just fitting my preferences. Is it producing better results? Because if it's not producing better results, I need to do something fundamentally different. I need to be able to measure those things over a period of time. So number one, the coaches need to be able to have access. And then they also need to use that, which is more of a litmus test on your current coaching. Is, are they doing this as a default? If they're not, that's something to look into. And kind of ask some questions about like, why is my coach not doing this? Again, I coach coaches. So I understand that this is not super common for them, but this is just, when we're talking about accomplishing something at a very high level, something like playing Division I golf, everyone needs to understand what's going on, and they need to be ready to be serious about this stuff. And there's a big difference between helping somebody stop slicing and helping a player play Division I golf. And so that's just one of those things where you guys kind of want to litmus test, make sure that your coach is using data, and they're not just using it as like oh, hey, this data is cool, but they actually can say like, okay, based on this information, here's what we're going to do strategically. Okay, here's how you want to see them reacting to that data and adapting what they're doing with you based on that information. All right, cool. So now we're kind of getting into the nitty gritty of like what particular statistics you want to be able to have. The first one, penalty rate off the tee. A lot of times people reduce, kind of their statistic off the tee as like fairways hit. In my opinion, it's a completely worthless statistic because the difference between hitting the fairway and being in the rough for a PGA Tour player is like 0.25 shots. So almost nothing. And then when we just kind of consider, it's like, there's a lot of junior golfers who might actually be better from the rough than they are from the fairway. So again, it's not an impactful number as opposed to something like penalty rate off the tee. If we know what your penalty rate is off the tee, and let's say it's 10%, well, we're essentially giving away 2 shots per round, assuming those are just hazards. If it's out of bounds, we're giving away 4 shots per round. So if if we don't know that, and when you look at all your other statistics, like we're going to be shooting ourselves in the foot. We're not going to have a lot of clarity on what the heck's going on and why you're struggling. We're not going to be able to quantify. You could say, hey, well, I hit my driver really good. I could look at your statistics and be like, well, we hit 10% out of bounds or in a hazard. I don't care how good you hit it. Something, whatever your standard of good is, it's not good. And so we need to adjust that. So that's the first one we definitely need to have. Greens and regulation is the next one. Almost every statistics tool is going to have greens and regulation. If it doesn't have greens and regulation, don't even bother looking through the rest of this stuff. Greens and regulation is super important. It's the most correlated statistic that we really have with how well you're going to score. Just by the simple fact of like, how many bogeys do you think you're going to make if you start at every hole on the green? None, or almost none, depending on how terrible your three-putt rate is. If you hit a ton of greens, you're going to score better. If you hit fewer greens, you're going to score worse. Anyone who tells you greens and regulation doesn't matter doesn't know what they're talking about. They might have read something somewhere, talk about the importance of like proximity or whatever. And maybe that's true on the PGA Tour level when we're kind of like splitting out. Well, do we want to push to 65% or 67% greens and regulation? In my opinion, amongst junior golfers, if you told me, hey, before anything, we start with 75% greens hit, I want that. I'm going to take that all day, every day, because it takes all these kind of problems out of play. You don't have to hit, it really simplifies the game. So if you guys object to that, I can do other videos on kind of like why I have that opinion. But just greens regulation, max that number out, and you want to be able to track it. Scrambling is the next one. Relatively simple. The reason I like to track scrambling, and the reason that you need to have scrambling, is it tells us what happens when you miss the green. How often do we make par, and how often do we not make par? Because ideally, we should be in a position where if we miss the green, we don't make worse than bogey unless we three-putt. Right? So that means if we're in a bunker, we don't leave ourselves in the bunker. If we need to hit the ball onto the green, we don't leave ourselves off the green. That's going to cost us a ton of shots. But if we can reduce every time we miss the green down to I made bogey, well, now we're in a situation where let's say we hit nine greens and miss 9 greens. Well, we know that the worst score that we should shoot would be 81. Okay? Or 9 over, right? We're not going to make bogey every single time. That doesn't seem very, very realistic, right? So even if we're hitting 9 greens, we should be in a position where it's like, we're shooting somewhere between like, 81 and 76, right? But realistically, it's probably like 78, 76. Maybe we get up and down a bunch and maybe we're 74. But that's something we want to know. It's just like, what should it be? It doesn't mean it's guaranteed to be what it is, but that's an important statistic to know. 3-putt rate. When we hit the green, how many shots do we give up on the green? Pretty simple, but if we have hit a ton of greens in regulation, but we're 3-putting all the time, that's something we really want to know. Last one's birdie conversion rate. When we do hit the green, how often do we make birdie? So it's essentially 2 different sides of that coin. We've got what happens, just to kind of like sum all these up. We've got what happens off the tee. Do we lose any shots there? Okay. If I'm in the rough, theoretically, that's going to push into greens and regulation, right? If it's really hard to hit shots out of the rough, then, greens regulation could be affected by that. And we can get to that downstream. But the first one we want to look at is just like, what happened off the tee? Do we lose any shots? No. Okay, cool. Greens and regulation. Where are we at there? All right, cool. When we don't hit the green, what happens? When we do hit the green, how often are we giving up shots from the green? And then when we do hit the green, how often do we make birdie? If I've got those numbers, I'm going to be able to paint a very clear picture of what a player should shoot on average. And just so you guys know this isn't just kind of like made up stuff, this is a spreadsheet that I give all my students. This is a big part of how we make decisions. But this is an example of Scotty Scheffler when I grabbed this data. And so you guys can actually see that this stuff plays out really, really nicely. Greens and regulation, 73%, scrambling, 66%, 3-putt, essentially 2%, birdie conversion rate, roughly 37%. He should shoot on average just a little bit worse than 3 over, which is pretty much what he shoots. And so again, we want to be using these numbers to predict what we're going to shoot so we can make decisions. Now, once we've got this information, we need a few drill down metrics. So we can't just look at greens regulation and say, hey, it needs to go up. Like, yeah, that's important. But then it's like, how, right? So let's kind of like go through this at another level. Penalty rate off the tee. Which clubs do we hit out of bounds? Do we hit our 3-wood out of bounds? Do we hit our 2-iron off of bounds? Do we hit our driver out of bounds? That's going to be kind of important information when we're making decisions. Let's say you're going to a tournament and you don't feel super confident off the tee with your driver. We want to be able to put some numbers to that. And if we can say, hey, well, objectively, it's better for you to hit your 3-wood right now. There is a time and a place for us to say, let's figure out how to hit this driver. But for the sake of let's play well in this tournament, we're going to want to go ahead and hit the 3-wood. We want to be able to know what those numbers are, or vice versa, which happens plenty as well. Hey, driver we hit really well, 3-wood and 2-iron, or 3-wood and 5-wood are a little bit shaky. We're going to play away from those and we're going to hit more drivers. It's information you want to have. Distance off the tee by club is another one. So again, it's really hard to evaluate if you should hit driver or these other clubs. You don't know how far you hit them, right? And so if you're in a situation where it's like, maybe your penalty rate's higher with driver, but also you hit it much, much farther, well, then that kind of like might offset itself. And so that's information that you want to know. Moving on to greens and regulation, you want to have par 3, par 4, and par 5 greens in regulation. So you understand, if we're trying to increase this number, where are these shots going to come from? Because if we got a par 3, which in theory should be our worst holes, but for a lot of junior golfers, they actually do really, really well on par 3s because the approach shot is simple. It's one shot. The goal is to hit it on the green. Everyone understands that. So we've got par 3s, par 4s, which is 2 shots. We need to hit our tee shot in play, and we need to be able to hit our next shot on the green. Okay, where are we at there? And par 5s, we've got our 3 different shots or 2 shots, depending on how you approach those holes. But where is that? Par 5 should be close to 85, 90% greens in regulation. And if it's not, then we want to be able to ask why, right? Why is that not the case? And this is really important. We're using the statistics to say, how are we going to inform practice? How are we going to inform mindset? How are we going to inform decision-making? We have to know this information. The last one here, it looks like I bumped 2 of these up, is on green percentage. So we want to know from like 75 to 100 yards, how often do we hit it on the green? If you've got smaller buckets than that, that'd be great. My favorite has always been 10-yard buckets. That said, not every tool is going to do that. A lot of tools are going to have bigger gaps here. So we want to have at least 25-yard buckets so we can say, all right, 75 to 100 yards, we hit on the green 80% of the time. Currently, we're on par 5s. We hit it 50% of the time. So if I just lay up to that number, it's going to be a good decision, just objectively. I just improved my statistics by roughly a shot per round by making one simple decision, right? That's an example. For par 4s, if we've got distance off the tee and we know what our par 4 on green percentage is from the distance bucket that we're going to be on par 4s for the most of the time, let's say it's 125 to 150 yards. We hit it on the green 50% of the time. And we don't really have any penalty shots off the tee, but that's kind of like the bucket that we're in, 125 to 150 yards. Well, from a practice perspective, if we wanted to get that up to, let's say 70%, then we could say strategically, in practice, we want to get really good at hitting 125 to 150 yard shots. Like that's just the way that we want it. Hopefully it sounds relatively straightforward, but you would be amazed that you guys probably aren't doing this, and you'd be amazed that like most junior golfers don't think like this. You don't want to just go out there and randomly hit balls. You want to be like, okay, well, I want to see my game fitting together like puzzle pieces. And so if I hit my shot off the tee, I'm going to leave myself the shot all the time. I better be really, really good at it. And if I'm not good at it, I'm going to look at that in practice to say, okay, let's bring this number up. And so this is where this is really important. Let's say, tying this back into practice, let's say on November 11th, we decide, hey, you're at 50% from 125 to 150 yards. We want to be at 70%. And let's say we meet again in, let's say, January, let's say January 11th. Well, we want to be able to look at how many rounds did you play in that period of time? Looking over that period of time, did your greens and regulation get to? How did you perform in practice? We want to be able to look back at that and say, okay, did we improve this statistic or not? Because if we look back at that and say, hey, this didn't move at all, well, it would be reasonable to believe that the rest of your scores didn't move much at all either, or at least whatever we were doing to address that particular issue was not effective. So hopefully this makes sense. Going on to the next one here, proximity around the green for scrambling is going to be an important one for you to know, because a lot of scrambling actually has very little to do with how good your short game is. It has to do with where you left yourself on your approach shot and how good your putting is. So I'm not a big fan of up and down games or stuff like that. I want to look at just, are we leaving ourselves in a position where, we have a chance at making this putt? And is it kind of, where it should be, more or less? There's not a ton of, stuff that I like to put into scrambling because it has very little impact on the overall scores that you have. So, you can look at me like, how do I get more up and down more? I'd rather just look at it as like, how do we hit more greens? It's just a much higher value, effort. Now on the PGA Tour, They don't have as much margin for error, though. They're not going to get to a place where they hit 80% of their greens. And so, they might care a little bit more about the scrambling rate or how sharp their short game is. But for the most part, scrambling, we just want to know, around the greens as a statistic here. The other place you're really going to want to know and make sure you have data on is your make rate from 5 to 10 feet, because 5 to 10 feet is where most decent chip shots are going to go. You're going to have a 6-footer, 7-footer out of the rough from, 12 yards. It's not a bad chip shot. And so your scrambling rate is going to be very highly correlated with what your make rate is from 5 to 10 feet. So if it's bad and you need to improve it, that's a statistic that you need to know. Moving on to 3 putts here. We want to make sure, and this is just kind of like more putting in general. I'm kind of throwing it under the 3 putts, just kind of like as a drill down on putting specifically. We want to know the make rates inside of 15 feet by distance. So, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet. What percentage of these putts are we making or missing? I can't tell you guys how many times I talk to a student and they 3-putt a lot and they spend all their time hitting their putts from like 6 to 9 feet. And I'm like, you never hit putts from 6 to 9 feet except to get up and down. Like, it's not a useful thing as far as 3-putting. 3-putting all comes down to how good is your lag putting, because you're going to have the majority of your shots on the green are going to be from 20, 30, and 40 yards, which is where you probably are going to get your 3 putts. And those putts should be going to inside 10% of that total distance. So again, if you've got a 20-footer, 2 feet. If you've got a 30-footer, 3 feet. If you've got a 40-footer, 4 feet. If you've got a 50-footer, 5 feet. And then you need to be really solid at making your putts from 3, 4, and 5 feet. If you can do that really well, you're not going to 3-putt very often, because, like, think this through. How many times are you going to have a 70-footer and then also not be able to get that putt inside that 5-foot window? It's not going to happen very often. And so you need to know what those statistics are, so you can say, okay, my 3-putt rate's too high. Specifically, it's because I'm not making my 3-footers, 4-footers, and 5-footers. The other side of that coin is, where are you leaving your second putt? You need to be able to know this stuff if you want to bring down your 3-putt rate, because on the flip side, you can be really good from 3, 4, and 5 feet. You could have a really solid putting stroke. You can do all that stuff. But then it becomes like, all right, are you leaving yourself 8-footers from, 12 feet or 25 feet or, whatever? Where's your second putt ending up? Because that's going to be the other side of that coin. You need to know that statistic as well. And then birdie conversion rate specifically, you want to know what your make rate is from 10 to 15 feet roughly. You're not going to make a ton of putts from 20 feet. You can't really practice trying to make putts from 20 feet. That becomes more of a speed game, lower probability making those putts. 10 to 15 feet, we can be at 30, 40% make rate from that distance. So if we're in a position where we need to increase birdie conversion rate, which, just for the record, all you guys watching this, odds are you probably don't need to do that. If you're not in a position where you're already shooting essentially par as an average, which means you're probably like a +3 or a +4 competitively, you probably don't need to do this. Now, if you're in that position, then this is the area that you're going to need to focus on the most. But these are the statistics that you need to have. So if you don't already have a tool that's tracking this stuff, you need one. And if you're using a tool right now that isn't tracking this stuff, it's just not going to be as effective as it could be. I don't care how much you've invested into it. I don't care who told you to use it. Or if somebody else told you to use it, they should be able to articulate for you like this why they need those particular statistics or why you need those particular statistics. And then you should also be able to show in practice, yeah, I do use all this information and I'm really happy with my progress and the rate of improvement. You should be able to quantify all that stuff. So if you're in a position where you're like, hey, I'm improving by like 5 shots a year, and I've been using this data and I use every little bit of it, and I know exactly what I need, then it's like, okay, cool. You have nothing to change. You have nothing to screw with. But this is for everyone else who's like unsure about this stuff. These are the statistics that you need. Now, my recommendation is a tool called Draw More Circles. Been really lucky to be able to get to know the CEO fairly well. I've been able to ask him for particular features and particular statistics that I just referenced for you guys. So they're a really fantastic company. I know everybody is on stuff like Decade. Scott Fawcett's fantastic. He's got great strategy stuff. I just don't love the stats app. There doesn't have custom date ranges last time I checked. And it's just a bit too much information for me on just kind of like what there is. And at the end of the day with statistics, we don't want just tons of information. We want the right information. So again, not a huge fan, but I know a lot of people out there like it. Everyone, like all the college coaches, are really on Clipped right now as far as like a tool that they really enjoy. Personally, I'm still learning to use it. I find circles to be a much smoother interface. I find Clip to kind of have some odd features. I know that they have their integration with like Arcos and stuff like that, but personally, Circles is my favorite just because it has all these statistics that I need. It's very easy to use, and I can do everything that I need to do, which is really at the end of the day what's the most important. So again, Circles, you can separate out tournaments versus practice. We can get specific date ranges, and we can do custom date ranges. We're going to be able to see player trend lines, which is very valuable. And then I'll just show you guys how to get all these statistics that I just mentioned. So if you guys go ahead and sign up for Circles, this is something I give all my students a discount for. They get like a $500 discount for the high-end package for Circles. But anyway, so on this first page, you're going to get almost everything. So you've got birdie conversion rate, greens regulation, scrambling, three putts, and then we're going to have to dig into detailed view on off the tee. And penalty rate will be right there. Okay. So that's the high level statistics. Now, if we're going to drill down, you guys would have just seen this as well. So you're going to have your penalty rates. You're going to have your fairways hit and so on and so forth, kind of divided by the different club being hit. You're going to have your distance off the tee. And then moving over into approach shots, each one of these is going to have the off the green or on green percentage, marked for each one of these. So it's going to be very easy to figure out exactly how often you're hitting the green. And you can also go into into short game as well to get your shorter, 60 to 100 yard shots. So under 75 yards, 75 to 100 yards. And then for short game specifically, we're going to have all of our proximities here. So we just know, again, if we want to set up a drill in practice, we can actually set up the specific number that we're trying to improve on. For putting, we're going to be able to see from 3 to 5 feet, what are those make rates right here. From over 15 feet, we're going to be able to see the proximities here. So again, 25 to 30 feet, we're going to actually have the distance proximity here of our second putt, so on and so forth, all the way up to over 50 feet. What's our average proximity? What's our average proximity? So we can actually use that to say, all right, when we're doing our lag putting drills, what standard do we want to actually perform at? 7 and 21 feet, we're going to see our putts made from 10 to 15 feet. So again, we're going to have all of these statistics, and I believe that 5 to 10 feet, yep, right here. And so again, just throw you guys out kind of an example so you guys know I'm not just making this stuff up. 5 to 10 feet, I didn't look at this ahead of time. 56% make rate. What do you guys think scrambling is going to be? 57. So again, those are the statistics you want to know. Oh, I forgot. Greens regulation, par threes, par fours, par fives. Again, those are the statistics that you're going to want to be able to reference using whatever tool that you've got. So hopefully this video is helpful for you guys to kind of understand what you should be looking for in a stats tool. Hope you guys understand why I enjoy Circles specifically. But yeah, hopefully this just helps you guys kind of move forward in kind of your understanding of how to be tracking stats. Again, I've got students that are as young as 10 years old that are doing this. I've got students who are obviously at a much higher level and much older than that, but this is a very easy to use tool. That's very easy to take all that information I just went over and translate it into practice, translate it into strategy, translate it into mindset. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video. If you have, go ahead, leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, go ahead and subscribe so you can get more videos like this. So see you guys in the next one.